Many of us have heard the recent protests being compared to 1968. It was a year that changed America. The Vietnam War was raging, Martin Luther King Jr. and Bobby Kennedy were both assassinated. And then there were the police. In Chicago, as protesters marched on the Democratic Convention, the police fostered a riot. Tear gas and nightsticks filled the nightly news channels. The majority of Americans, particularly the older generation, looked on and thought the police were in the right. Nixon ran on a law and order ticket and won. As we've seen a rise in progressivism over the past several years, leading to the election of the first black president, there's been a quietly developing counterbalance. The militarization of the police, the war on drugs, mass incarceration. The days of the Andy Griffith Show and its kindly Sheriff Taylor of Mayberry has been replaced with tanks and riot gear. Now there's talk of defunding the police as hundreds of thousands protest against police brutality. It's not just one bad cop that needs to change. It's a system. Today on The Uncomfortable Truth, we're going to talk about this with a former cop who has a unique perspective on all of this because he's also African American. This is Loki Mulholland, and it's time to get uncomfortable. Well, today we're joined by our usual guest, freedom writer and civil rights activist LeVon Brown. LeVon, how you doing?
All right, Loki, how are you?
Oh, good. I don't know if I should keep calling you a guest anymore. So let me try that again. Today we're joined by our usual co-host, LeVon Brown, and civil rights activist. Don Carter spent 10 years as a police officer in the Midwest, and today he lives in the Bay Area where he's a transformational coach with executives, entrepreneurs, and visionary leaders. His mission is to help people shift their perspectives of the world to prove that it's not as hostile as they believe. These shifts help bring about dynamic transformation for his clients towards deeper healing and greater expression of their untapped potential. And Don had seen the uncomfortable truth and reached out to me, and as we were talking, I've come to learn he was a police officer. So I asked him if he would join us on this podcast because I wanted to talk about this culture within the police force. And so, Don, can you first give us a little background on your story, what you shared with me previously from when you were a cadet and went into training and what happened?
Yeah. First of all, thank you for allowing me to be here. This is a great conversation. I think is needed in a lot of places. But I was a cop for about 10 years in the Midwest. I was actually on the Kansas City Police Department, and I'm from a neighborhood, urban Black neighborhood that historically has experienced the disparities that are typical of a Black American inner city, gangs, violence, drugs, that type of thing. So when I decided to be a police officer, it was because I wanted to help rebuild my community. It's because I wanted to help serve for its betterment in some way. So I was about 25 when I started and went to the police academy and ended up being valedictorian of my class, which I understand that performance in the training setting is different than out in the streets. So I didn't take that for granted. But when I got into the field with my field training officer was the first time in my life that I'd ever really experienced any direct forms of racial discrimination or racism, especially from police. Being on the police department was the first time in my life that I had experienced any direct racial discrimination or racism from police. And that situation went like this. I was on a call that I was with my field training officer, and we handled the call together, even though under normal circumstances, I should have been calling another car to come and help me so that my training officer could observe and train me. We were blacked out, as they called it, which meant that there were no cars available for service. And we went to this disturbance. Now, this man, I remember, he was an older Black man. He was born in 1933. Like, I remember that. And so he was older, but not unfit. And he had been in a disturbance with his girlfriend, who I guess was several decades his junior. And so she had already gone. There was nobody else at the scene, just the three of us. And I was having a conversation with him, and he began to describe the situation, and he started getting animated, waving his hands a little bit. And I'm standing fairly close to him. And as soon as I go to address the escalation of his demeanor, even though I understood that he was just being emotive, As soon as I went to address it, my FTO goes hands on and starts grabbing the guy and moving him to the ground. So I'm shocked. The old man is shocked. And so I just kind of stand there and I'm like, not really sure what's going on. And he's confused and struggling because it's kind of a shock. And my FTO looks up at me and is like, aren't you going to help me get him in cuffs? And so I was like, okay, I guess I'll help. So we got him in cuffs, ended up running his name, and he had some $150 parking warrant. And so we took him to jail on that. Now, it's not atypical for everybody who we encounter when you're training to go and book them on whatever charges they have just to get the repetition of learning how to do it properly. So that wasn't a huge deal. But when I got there at the station, he ended up signature bonding him, which means he let him sign for his own bond and sent him walking home. It was just probably 5 or 6 blocks from his house, but I still didn't understand it and was confused by the whole scenario. I never said anything to anybody because I'm just handling business and standing by waiting for my FTO to come back so we can go back out into the field. And then I get called into my captain's office. Now, captain is a couple of ranks above officer. So we have a sergeant who's our supervisor, and then the captain runs that watch of that division. And I sit down at her desk, also a white female, and she says, well, do you think your FTO used excessive force? And I just go on to say, well, no, I don't think he used excessive force. Or I said I wouldn't say that, but I would have handled it differently. And then she looks at me and she says, you think you, a brand new officer, know how to better handle this than this 7-year veteran? And then I just sort of casually answered and was like, no, I wouldn't say that, but I would have handled it differently because I know my people and I know that he wasn't being threatening to me. And he was just being emotional. And then she paused and she looked at me and she said, what do you mean your people? And that's the moment that I realized that something was off. And then so I kind of backpedal a little bit and I was like, well, just inner city blacks. Like, this is my neighborhood. This is close to where I grew up. I just know that he wasn't somebody who was being threatening to me. So I would have just handled it differently. And that one statement of, I know my people, that conversation was just between myself and my captain. But that one conversation marked the rest of my experience as a training officer or as a cadet. And I had a break-in experience after that that was marked with just sort of a standoffish evaluating way. I never really felt like I was getting trained. I felt like I was getting evaluated and then marked on things that I didn't know in the first place. So several weeks later, I'm in my captain's office again and she's like, hey, how do you think you're doing? And so I said, hey, well, I think I'm doing pretty good. I've made some mistakes, but I've never made the same mistake twice. And I go on a little bit and then she stops me and says, we don't think you're doing too good. And you should we're going to recommend your termination. And so then she follows up immediately after that and says, so you should resign so you can retain whatever certification you have. And at this point, obviously I'm sweating and nervous because this is my career. I'm just starting. And all of a sudden I'm being told that I'm going to be fired or recommended for termination because they make it difficult to fire anybody really. But I told her that I know I could do the job so that I wasn't going to quit. And here's why. I had a conversation even before I went into the police academy, thankfully with a black sergeant. And I remember that conversation in that moment because he told me something that originally I wasn't so sure about why he was saying it, but then I knew. We're having a conversation and he says, whatever you do, don't quit. And I was like, well, of course I'm not going to quit. Like, I want to do this. This is going to be my career, blah, 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 whatever. And so then he's like, no, whatever you do, don't quit. So when she said that they were going to recommend my termination, and then she tried to encourage me to resign, that's when I remembered that statement of his. And so later on, I'm talking to him and he's like, and I still am not associating this with my race in particular, but it just feels off. I didn't understand it. And he tells me, he's like, yeah, you come out of the police academy as a valedictorian. You're the kind of guy who might be the chief of police one day. Like, they don't want you in there. They want their guy in there. And so I still was a little reluctant to take that on. But then a, a little while later, probably some weeks later, this was right when I was getting off a break in, I ran into one of my academy instructors who asked me, she said, "What is this that I was hearing talking about something about your people?" And that's when it hit me that this conversation that I had with this woman in an office, just the two of us, a statement that I said went all around the whole department back to the police academy, that struck a bell, that rung a bell for some reason within that culture. And from that point on, I was able to see a little bit more. I'd had several of my academy um, classmates who were Black who also got washed out or who just had some struggle in one way or another that it seemed to be unjustified from the outside. But inside police culture, um, there are these unspoken rules, these norms, these ways of seeing that are not, in my opinion, conducive to being one, authentically human, and two, being Black. Um, that assimilation is what people what the culture almost demands. And so if you're going to maintain some level of your own humanity, and especially as a Black person, specifically from the inner city, there's this pressure where it's not explicit, but there's a real pressure to assimilate to police culture, that somehow there's some allegiance that you have to make either to police or to wherever or whoever you were before that.
My work has taken me to a lot of places, and I've been fortunate to meet some incredible people. But when I came to Selma and met Joanne Blackman Bland, I knew I was in the presence of greatness. Joanne was 11 years old when she was attacked on the Edmund Pettus Bridge on Bloody Sunday in 1965. She wasn't old enough to vote, but understood its importance enough to be there. After Selma is an in-depth look at how our right to vote has eroded since the signing of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. The fight for the right to vote continues. Get informed. You can find After Selma on Amazon Prime or visit LokiMulholland.com to purchase a copy for your collection.
Do you think that's because that they wanted you out because you were Black, or because they felt that you didn't fit the culture?
Yeah, so I considered that it was a combination of the two. Um, Me being exclusively Black makes it that much more difficult for me to assimilate to the culture
Right.
because the culture itself is predicated on objectifying human beings, and then specific human beings who look like myself get objectified more than others. And I don't say that it's intentional. It's implicit. It's inside the culture. It's like it's insidious enough to where I don't even think some of the people think that it's in there until you experience it. Because there's very few people who are walking around saying very explicit things that have to do with race. But there's also a typical thing that young officers coming in say that they want to do. And it's like you ask somebody why they want to be a police officer, and you get this response: I want to put bad guys in jail. Well, then you have to ask the question, if you're thoughtful enough, who's the bad guy? And in American culture specifically, we understand when you look at history that the Black male has been vilified in a particular way, that it's inside all of us um, to see Black men as either threatening or hostile or menaces to society. Um, like we think of Black men as what we call criminals. And obviously, we don't say that everyone is, but it's in our subconscious, I believe, because of how much it's been embedded into American culture and society.
So it sounds like if you're not the bad guy, you have the potential to be.
Yeah, absolutely. That that we're not quite sure yet. And if you think that your people are the people that we patrol the most, like what like that's the feel I got, was like, what do you mean your people?
So culturally, we have this idea of the criminal Black man. Then within the police force, is that just being accentuated in a self-feeding loop, and the idea that, well, the reason why there's so many Black people arrested is because they commit all the crimes, but in actuality is the police are targeting African Americans?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple different dynamics to speak to about that. Is that in lower economic areas, you'll have the cycle of drugs and violence and crime and gangs and that kind of thing. And those are sociological issues that probably have, I mean, I'm not a sociologist or historian, so I can't speak to them completely, but from my experience, it's that those kind of activities are predicated on partly the economic uh, disparity in those areas. And so when you have more occurrences of that kind of activity, then they get over policed. And so it's not even just that crime is more or increasing, it's just that because police are there, they are interacting in a certain way that causes the statistics to go up about the activity that's observed. Um, and so it is sort of it's a self-sustaining loop, um, because it's not really that there's more crime there, it's that they're policed more there. So the instances of those crimes get recorded. Um,
But why are the police patrolling there more?
That's a good question. And I know that when we first get on as police officers, we're required to be in an inner city um, division so that we can get the most activity and get acclimated to policing. And
Wait a second. Wait a second. Step back.
yeah,
You just said as you come on as a police officer, the
yep,
first place they send you is the inner city.
yep,
So isn't that already as a police officer you're already being programmed to think?
yeah, yeah. So that's what I would say about police culture. It's training, it's programming to help you see the world in a specific way. And that's why I said when you want to put bad guys in jail, the question is who's the bad guy. And the reality about policing or emergency response or just yeah, policing and emergency response, that policing by its nature is reactive. Like there aren't any preventative measures for anything, and so they're always showing up after something's done, and then cleaning up the mess, so to speak. So there's not any positive actions that are happening by police for the most part. And so people tend to think that beefing up the police presence is what helps actually decrease those criminal or I say criminal activities loosely, um, but criminal activity. And in actuality, I don't know if that's true. I think that it actually perpetuates the cycle to a degree because honestly, there's not, even in a city like Kansas City, you still deal with a small percentage of the population who are doing most of what we would consider crimes. And it's not like the whole of an urban neighborhood is crime ridden and and that there's everybody that is breaking the law of any kind, but that's the perception. And so put heavy police presence in those areas to suppress crime. But all you're really doing is aggravating something that is it's not as big as it is until you get there. I've seen generally that police presence escalates situations um, more than it actually diffuses them. And that's a general statement, but most of the time we're not dealing with this high, hard charging crime, uh, like fighting crime. Most of the stuff is just responding to people's everyday not knowing how to deal with the issues that they have in some way, so they call the police.
Right.
It's rarely crime.
So you start to become social workers at that point.
Yeah, yeah.
But so let's take a George Floyd. Okay.
Hmm.
Uh, and I want to go back to this moment with this old man. Your people, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And he's a little more animated, and you're okay with that. He's just speaking the way he speaks.
Yep.
And the white officer going, "Oh my gosh, this is a threat."
See, I didn't even get to talk to him about it to know that he thought it was a threat, but I just saw him just take action as if there was some real threat to me. He
Right.
claimed that it was some real threat to me.
Right. It's so. Was that a common occurrence? Because obviously, now George Floyd is, we would see that as the extreme, but clearly it's not. I mean, it's more the norm of how police officers seem to be dealing with people of color.
So when we talk about this is what the nature of what policing does to the human being who is doing the police work, the officers. the agents of law enforcement, um, because they become conditioned to see the world almost exclusively as a place with problems that they are there to solve, and that they do it by means of control. They are dehumanizing themselves. They don't get to express the full spectrum of human emotions. And in fact, it's suppressed in them. And so I see the things that and the ways that police officers treat people as a result of that conditioning. And so most of the people that I know that are in law enforcement started out their careers wanting to do good for society. So they go from a place of service to a place of survival within the span of about 2 or 3 years. And you can almost see it. It's like clockwork because there's a few things that are happening. People who want to do good believe that doing police work is going to be helpful to society because they get to put bad guys in jail. Quotes, put bad guys in jail. But it's so unclear who the bad guy is when you actually get into the work, and then the way that the system works with prosecution, and there's just so much disgruntled uh, behavior of officers after a few years when they see that their efforts really aren't doing something to solve crime or solve society's problems. And so you're dealing with a bunch of people who are in high stress situations all the time, only seeing the world as a bad place because they're only dealing with people at their worst times in their worst circumstances. So they see everybody as bad. And when I was I remember in the academy, they called it, they actually described this process and they called it the upside down asshole theory. That at the beginning of your career, like you're fresh, you're new, you're energetic, and you see the whole world, and only the quote bad guys are the assholes. Before long, it's the bad guys and the citizens because they won't do anything to help. Or then it's the bad guys, the citizens, and then the prosecutor's office or the government, the what is it, the command staff. Like so, then you end up having it to where at the end of the day, everybody else is an asshole except for your partner, and you're not even sure about him half of the time. Like this is how they literally said this stuff in the academy. And so that shows the degrading nature of having that perspective for so long. That all you're doing is looking out into the world, looking for its problems, or only responding to people at the worst times in their lives, because nobody calls the police when things are going good. And so you have human beings who have objectified themselves enough because they've suppressed their real human emotions so that they can do a job. And it's understandable, but I don't think it's healthy. And so those are the people that you have going out. And so when you have something like George Floyd, where he's got a guy that's sitting on his back and his neck with his hands in his pocket for almost 10 minutes, it's like, where's the connection to this man's humanity? You got people who are yelling, hey, he's saying he can't breathe. He just passed out. Or you got him yelling those things, but there's just a deadening that happens inside the human being when they look at the world as only a bad place. And so that's what happened to me, which is why I left. The situation that led me to recognize that it was time for me to go was that as a detective, I was a detective in violent crimes in the robbery section. So we investigated armed robberies, business robberies, home invasions, that kind of thing. And I'm sitting in front of this girl, a young Black girl, probably in her 20s, and I'm interviewing her about what happened. And I don't remember exactly what it was, but I think it was like a home invasion type deal. But she's devastated by this situation. She's crying, snotting, can't barely talk. And so when I'm asking her questions about what happened, she can't almost even tell me because she's just so overwhelmed by this. So I remember some of my thoughts at that time was like, is she really for real? Like, is it really that bad? And then what comes out of my mouth is just the question, okay, what happened next?
Hmm.
Okay, what happened next? And so then I had this moment where it was almost like I was having this out of body experience looking down on myself from the corner of the room, which it could have been after I was watching the video of the interview later, which is funny. But I felt like I just had this moment where I was like, dude, what the heck? Like, this is not the kind of person we want to be. All this girl needs is somebody to have some compassion and just to be with her. And you are just saying just the facts, ma'am. And so that's where I noticed the disconnect in myself. And so the reason that I became a police officer, which was to serve and rebuild my community, to serve the people, was no longer in effect. And I was probably more resilient than some because I had the intention of being. of not assimilating to those parts of the culture. And so it took me 8.5 years, where maybe most people it just takes 2 or 3. And so then that's when I knew I had to leave.
In my other life, I'm a filmmaker, and one of my more fascinating films I created is the award-winning film titled Black, White, and Us. It's about viewing racism through the lens of transracial adoptions in Utah. Utah? Yeah, Utah. It just so happens to be the transracial adoption capital of the world. So what happens when white families who didn't believe racism existed anymore adopts a black child? Find it on Amazon Prime or visit LokiMulholland.com to purchase a copy for your collection.
So if I got this right, the one of the things that happens to the young police officer is first the humanity is removed.
Yeah.
So and then you become numb to feelings of emotion, feelings of I guess your emotions become numb,
Yeah.
and you are no longer on the side of the people that you're trying to help. Now, do you think that's on purpose? In other words, the neighborhood that you were talking about, where
Mhm.
you were talking about the old man. One is, well, that's not how police officers think. The other is, police were not organized to be helping that kind of person anyway.
Mhm.
The police were organized to protect property, to protect the rich, to protect, and I don't mean the rich in a negative way, but
Yeah.
basically possessions,
Yeah.
money.
Yep.
And these people didn't have that. So that's where you're going to get your arrests. That's where the prosecutor is going to make their career. And those are the people that can't afford to get a lawyer.
Right.
So you already know going in that they don't believe in you, despite the fact that you're trying to be different. Eventually, you learn that they don't believe in you. The power structure does not believe in you. So you become numb. And you have a decision to make. Do I get my 20 or do I get out? Is
Yeah.
that about what happened to you?
I would say that it's partly what happened to me. I was never associating the way I was being treated as me being black at first. And
Right.
this is because I didn't see the world that way. I wasn't looking for it. I wasn't trying to be um I wasn't trying to have everything equated to have something to do with my race. But as I looked at it as objectively as I could, especially in retrospect, I understood it. It was like,
Right.
oh, okay. Yeah, me coming in here as a black man that's doing this, that has this, like, and that I'm not willing to completely assimilate to the culture. I'm just being a good guy. I'm doing the best I can to serve people. Like, that is what just didn't mesh with the culture. So people either they didn't understand it or they just thought it didn't belong. And I felt like I didn't belong for the whole of my career. It was only after I left that I learned that people at least respected me or esteemed me in some way, just for my character. And
Right.
I just say that the process of becoming an agent of law enforcement, which is designed to protect the life and property of the people who commissioned it in the first place. And if you look at obviously some of the historical aspects of where policing comes from, that it was probably what working class people who were serving the interest of the public, but it was the public directed by the people who were in government. Or um, and so and I know that there's some, at least that I've learned in some respect, that there's some connection to slave patrol, that some of the roots of how we do policing have come from. It's all varied, but what I would say about the culture, whether it's intended or not, it's become something that puts the people that are there under an immense amount of pressure to put their humanity aside so that they can do this job seemingly objectively. But obviously human beings are governed by natural biases that we're aware of or not aware of. And so those things come into play. And because as a whole culture, especially in the United States, we've vilified Black men in particular, that we have a certain way of seeing Black people. And Yeah, so it just becomes something that those people have a way of being that continues to even more deeply objectify the people who have been dehumanized by society at large.
Let me ask you a question.
Yeah,
Why do you think that black men stay on as police officers? With all you just said, why do they stay?
because it's a good job.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean that's the best that I got.
No,
It's
that's what I thought. I just was.
when I when I see the officers who make it into their 20 and 30-year careers, um, it's with the level of it's not even resolve at that point. It's man, I don't even have the word, but they have had a level of disconnect from they do their job and they go home. That's the kind of thing. It's like it just becomes it's just a job. That it's a good job. They get some freedom. They get and it's something that they love to do because they have opportunities within that that they make for themselves to contribute to the community in some way, make way for other officers to come in and stay on. The only reason that my career was even saved was because a black captain and a black major of another division brought me to their division. Because if I stayed where I was, it would have been too much probably.
Yeah. So then there's this subculture within there uh, of a black police officer.
Hmm.
And Levon, you've talked about this quite often. I know Don, you and I have talked about this, but wherein black police officers need to show that they belong.
Well, some of the toughest, the meanest guys I've ever seen were black cops because they had to be different than or the same as. Let me put it to be seen as the same as a white police officer. They have to be tougher, so they can't uh, help their people. They can't help each other. They just got to be tough. And the first time I saw this was in Chicago. I thought, oh, how wonderful! This is years ago that they got black police officers. And then I realized that those were some of the meanest son of a bitches I'd ever met. Now, they weren't all that way, but I realized after a while that to be a member of the club, they had to not be a member of my club. They had to be tougher than the white guy to be seen as an equal.
Hmm.
And I think that still goes on because everyone I know who has been a policeman for a while is that way. They may sound different to me, but when they go into work so that they are not excluded, they become the meanest SOB you ever saw. Why? Because they want to be seen as the same as the white guy. Because I used to try to talk to the policemen in the neighborhood and all that stuff. They don't. They hear me, but they can't respond.
Hmm.
So they may talk to each other about Jesus Christ, what so and so did to me, but they can't. They have to be seen as one of the boys.
Yeah, that goes two ways. It's what is affectionately called the thin blue line, and it's that connection to the brotherhood of policing. Or I mean, I know there are women on police departments too, but it's the thin blue line. It's that place where you're either on one side or you're on the other, and so you can't ride the fence, and there is pressure about that. And so I can imagine that guys who, for whatever reason, because they want to just fit in the club or some other problems, potentially insecurity, whatever. Because most of the black police officers I know, they don't play that. Um, there were very few of the black officers that I knew that went that route of being extra mean and extra. But Kansas City might just have a different police culture. But it was more that they were quieted instead of being able to speak
Mm,
freely or being able to do what came naturally to them as black people toward other black people. They just kind of like shut down and like, oh, this is just the job. And every so often, you'd have people who would speak up against things that they observed with white officers, but it was very brief because that system is good about crushing that sentiment because it's not explicit.
right.
An Ordinary Hero was my first award winning documentary. is about the life of my mother, Joan Trumpauer Mulholland, and her participation in the civil rights movement. For most of us, our mothers are heroes because they're mothers, and mom is just mom. But when your mother's a civil rights icon, and yet you never really knew it, things change. Go check out An Ordinary Hero and find out how choosing to do what was right instead of what was easy helped change the world. You can find it on Amazon Prime, or visit LokiMulholland.com to purchase a copy for your collection. Would there be an element of racism within the police force, that when a black police officer, he's hearing all of this about his own people, and then he gets out there and it's like, man, you're not helping. I mean, you're really making us look bad.
Oh, absolutely. I've seen that conversation had several times on scenes too, where there's this sort of separation between. So it ends up being just this really toxic cycle of non-communication where I show up on the scene as a police officer that's black. I'm either somebody's looking to get some sort of leeway because I'm black, or they're cursing me because I don't give it to them and calling me Uncle Tom or whatever. So now the same thing that all police officers or a lot of police officers face, which is they're put in contention with their own communities, because especially in a place like Kansas City, like you have to patrol where you live, not necessarily the neighborhood, but you have to stay in the city limits. And so you're placed as an intermediary who's in contention with the people in their own community. So if you show up and somebody doesn't want you there, like you are the bad guy to them. So it's extra when you're black and you're going into the black neighborhood, because now if you're not, going all out to give somebody to hook up or be extra lenient on him, now you're Uncle Tom, you're a coon, you're this, you're that. And all of those things get thrown at you. And then you feel like, well, I'm out here trying to do stuff for you, but now you're just disrespecting me. Like, fine. And so there just becomes this toxic cycle. And I know white officers experience that too, to a degree, but it's even more. So this is the disparity, is that whatever difficulties there are in police culture for a regular human being, it's at least doubly so for black police officers. So that subculture has its own issues. And I was one that I didn't even ascribe to that, where I was just kicking it with the black police officers. And I didn't stay alone. I just mostly floated through the culture just as myself, as much as I could maintain that. But it was so hard. Like when I tell you that sitting in front of that woman, telling her that I wasn't going to quit because they thought that I was unfit to be a police officer, like that was one of the most courageous things I had to do, to go into that job every day feeling stressed out and scared that something was, like, I just felt like people were looking for a reason to make sure that I was gone.
Wow.
Yeah. So the relief that I had when I was in a division that was run by a black captain and then a black major who was over the whole division, it made it a lot more simple. Still on the everyday level with the citizens and police culture in general. But if I had stayed at that other division, it wouldn't have even been possible. I don't know if I could have handled it. And so the pressures that a human being feels by just going out and dealing with the problems of the world and in a thankless way and being vilified for it, it's more so even with black police officers. So those are parts of the culture that I think contribute to people just being completely unhealthy. And so they aren't equipped to deal with people in a humane way. It's actually the opposite. And so you get the result. And so when I see things like police brutality, when I see the killing of black men by police officers, I see that as a result of something rather than the cause of it. That as we look at how to change policing and as we look at, holding officers accountable to stuff, we're dealing with the extremities of a problem. That I likened it to this because it just made sense in my head when I thought about it. If somebody had a cough and you gave them a cough drop, but they really had COVID-19, that's the similarity to looking at just going after policing in a whole system that's designed to subjugate and dehumanize black people, and reckoning with that reality. And so you can treat the cough, but the disease is still there. You could change police reform and policies and all that, but the root of the issue is still in play. And so there's an element that it's not short-sighted. I think it's a good place to start, and I think it's a powerful place to start. But police officers are human beings that are doing a job that is part of a system or structure that they get programmed by.
Right. But you have this sense that the police are protecting themselves.
Yeah,
There's that perception.
that is exactly what it is. So this is what pissed me off the most, and I'll say that freely because that's just what it rose up in me because I never understood it as a part of the police culture, and it just annoyed me to hear it all the time. And they drilled this into your head from day one in the academy that your job is to go home at the end of the night. And then they'd have silly little sayings. I'll call them silly. I get it, but I think it's silly. Is that I'd rather be judged by 12 than carried by 6. And so those are the things. And that's what I'm talking about, where you move from a place of wanting to serve to a place of survival. That you go into your job every day just wanting to survive, whether it's the cultural, societal pressures or an encounter that you have with somebody where you have this perceived um, imminent death threat and you react because it's part of your training.
Want a great way to help a worthy organization and educate children about the civil rights movement? Visit our foundation, the Joan Trumpauer Mulholland Foundation, at thejtmfoundation.org. That's thejtmfoundation.org. We are a 501c3 established to help end racism through education. A $5 monthly recurring donation will provide curriculum for 30 students. As my mother used to say, I can't do everything, but I can do something, because doing nothing is not an option. If you have wanted to help in this cause, but didn't know how, now you can. The Joan Trumpauer Mulholland Foundation at thejtmfoundation.org. So you have this, you said, I'd rather be
judged
by 12
than carried by 6. Yeah.
So there's this other thing I've heard as well that you shoot to kill because they can't testify.
See, that's even more. I never heard that one, but yeah, it's that kind of thing where you're just out there to survive. Is us against them.
Because it's your word as a cop against someone else. Yeah. Well, if that person can't talk, then.
Yeah. I think in our culture, I think broadly, we think that there's this, these individuals who are hell bent on targeting and Black people. And so when a cop kills a Black man, you think it's that cop's direct perspective and intention and all of that. The people that like Philando Castile was one that really spelled this out for me. When I watched the killing of Philando Castile by that officer looked scared to me. Like that was the thing. He was scared. And that kind of reaction under that amount of stress, and in that moment where this guy's trying to tell him that he's a gun owner, carrier legally, and he's getting out his card to show him, all he sees is a Black man and he heard gun. And because of the programming that happens and the amount of stress, and I'm taking liberties here, obviously. So it doesn't even have to be somebody who is directly racist to play out the racial discrimination and racist agenda that happens with police forces.
Right, but you have the inherent bias already programmed into them. How much of that is actually taking place within the police force itself? Hey, look, guess what? When a guy, look, we have the stats. Yeah. We know that Black men are more likely to kill you than. Mm-hmm. Were those sort of conversations taking place?
Not ever explicitly.
Okay.
It was just the idea that when we go into a neighborhood, it was talk among officers. And it was the fact that these are the people that we arrest the most. When you see a Black dude with his pants sagging or like the typical gangster type thug image, you have a fear response because you think that person is more likely to do something to harm you than another. On the surface, they're teaching to try to look at people without that. But inside the culture, still, because of those biases that are already there, and because of the broader messages of American society, Like those, we come to the table with those things already, and they don't get addressed. So when they go unaddressed, when we don't learn how to actually communicate to people in an open way, then we move to control, and so there is a toxic cycle that happens, that causes more Black people to get targeted than not.
Thank you for listening to part 1 of Black and Blue, Policing and Black Lives in America. We hope you will join us for the second half of this special podcast with former police officer Don Carter.